Game 4. White. F.J. Marshall. Black. J.R. Capablanca. 23rd match game. New York, 1909. Queen's Gambit declined. Capablanca makes it look easy. With the smooth, effortless skill of a born magician, Capablanca makes a few deft passes, and the position on the board changes right before your eyes. In just a few brief moves, Capablanca manages to obtain a queenside majority of pawns. This slight positional advantage is enough in his talented hands to be decisive. The pawns advance at every opportunity, and their steady progress eventually compels Marshall to give up a piece to prevent one of them from queening. The continuation from that point on is unusually interesting. In only 14 more moves, Capablanca, who has won a bishop for 2 pawns, weaves an airtight mating net around Marshall's king. D4, D5, C4, E6, Knight C3, C5. Highly recommended by Tarrasch. This defense was used to good effect by Mises in his second match game with Rubinstein. C takes D5, E takes D5, Knight F3, Knight C6, G3, Bishop E6. Improving on Capablanca, I would suggest instead the development of the king side by Knight F6, Bishop G2, Bishop E7, castles as preferable. Back to the game. Bishop E6, Bishop G2, Bishop E7, castles, Knight F6, Bishop G5. The stronger line, discovered years later, is D takes C5, Bishop takes C5, Knight A4, Bishop to E7, Bishop to E3, castle, Knight D4, and White's position is inferior. Back to the game. After Bishop G5, Knight E4, a good move which frees Black's game. Bishop takes E7, Queen takes E7. Would anyone defending against the Queen's Gambit want a better position than this after 10 moves? Says Tarrasch proudly in justification of his pet line, the Tarrasch defense. Knight E5, but not D takes C5, Knight takes C3, B takes C3, Queen takes C5, and White's queen side is broken up. In the Rubinstein Mises game, White's Rook C1 led to play which enabled Mises to exploit his positional advantages, pressure on the open file, and queenside majority. The continuation is interesting, the more so as Rubinstein, the giant killer, is not often beaten so quickly and decisively. The game went on like this. Knight takes C3, Rook takes C3, c4, knight e5, castle, b3, queen b4, queen d2, rook a c8, rook f d1, b5, f4, knight takes e5, f takes e5, a5, b takes c4, rook takes c4, rook b3, if rook takes c4, queen takes d2, rook takes d2, and d takes c4, and black will soon have two connected passed pawns. After rook takes c4, rook b3, queen a4, e3, rook f c8, bishop f1, rook c2, queen e1, b4, bishop d3, queen takes a2, and white resigned in view of what might follow. For example, bishop takes c2, rook takes c2, rook d to b1, rook g2 check, king f1, bishop to h3, and white is helpless to ward off the threats of mate. Back to our game, the queen e7, knight e5 was played, knight takes d4. This is better than trying to break up white's pawns by knight takes c3, b takes c3, knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen d7, f4, castle, queen c2, and white has a respectable game. So after knight takes d4, knight takes e4, d takes e4, e3. If bishop takes e4, bishop h3, and suddenly three of white's pieces are attacked. Back to the game. After e3, knight f3 check, knight takes f3, e takes f3, queen takes f3, castle, Rook F to C1. Marshall avoids Queen takes B7, as after Queen takes B7, Bishop takes B7, Rook A B8, Bishop to E4, Rook takes B2. Black has a passed pawn and a rook on the 7th. Therefore, Rook FC1, Rook A to B8, Queen E4. Threatens Bishop H3. Which would either lead to an exchange of bishops or induce a weakening of Black's pawn structure by F5. Queen C7, Rook to C3. Capablanca has a slight positional advantage for the endgame in his queenside pawn majority. In most cases, a more effective weapon than a kingside majority. Black plans to get his queenside pawns rolling at every opportunity, as exchange of pawn leaves 2 pawns to 1, and a further exchange will leave him with 1 pawn to none. This last pawn might then either promote to a queen or cost the opponent a piece to prevent it from doing so. B5. Capablanca starts playing out his trumps, the queenside pawn majority. From now on, the pawns will push on every chance they get. A3. Not only to prevent B5, B4, when A takes B4, Rook takes B4, Queen takes B4 would be the penalty, but in order to mobilize the Queen Rook. C4. Bishop F3. White avoids B3 when Queen A5 attacks the rook and also threatens to capture the B pawn. White would be compelled to advance B4, leaving his opponent with a protected passed pawn. So Bishop F3, Rook FD8 takes command of the only open file. So small an advantage is hardly enough to be decisive, but it is the accumulation of these little advantages that brings an opponent to the breaking point and forces capitulation. Rook D1, Rook takes D1, Bishop takes D1, Rook D8. Capablanca has full command of the board. His play is an example of how slight advantages should be utilized. Lasker. Bishop F3, G6. A necessary precaution, as the king may require air sooner or later. It also renders feasible the continuation. 24. Bishop F5, followed by Rook to D2, Lacking the pawn move, there is this dreadful possibility. Rook d2, rook c2, bishop d5, queen e8, mate. Back to the game. g6, queen c6. Of course not rook c2 to prevent invasion of the 7th rank by the enemy rook, as bishop f5 wins a whole rook. So queen c6, queen e5. Black avoids the immediate exchange of queens, as he must then lose a move in protecting his b-pawn. Queen e4, queen takes e4, bishop takes e4. According to the authorities, white should have the superior position, as his bishop controls squares of a different color than do his pawns. Black, in violation of the precepts, has a bishop hampered by his pawns. Nearly all of which occupy squares of the same color. Theory is theory, but life, alas, refuses to conform. The great master relies on his own instincts, makes his own rules, and opens up new worlds. Rook d1 check. The rook swoops down to get behind the enemy pawns. King g2, a5. The queenside pawns move ahead every chance they get. Notice that black maintains a strong initiative, even though queens are off the board. Rook c2, b4, a takes b4, a takes b4. Bishop f3. If white tries king f3, centralizing his king and threatening to drive the rook off, he might fall victim to this strange contretemps. b3, rook e2, bishop h3, when suddenly his rook faces capture by bishop f1 and has no saving move. Back to the game. Bishop f3, rook b1, bishop e2. Anticipates c3, b takes c3, b3, rook d2, b2. Threatens to queen in a hurry by rook b1 to g1 check. Followed by the promotion of the pawn after the rook sacrifices itself on g1. However, the bishop goes to d3 and the pawn is lost. Back to the game. b3. This is the proper pawn push. Rook d2. Marshall avoids rook c3. Rook takes b2. Bishop takes c4. Because rook c2 wins by a neat sleight of hand. Back to the game. Rook d2. Rook c1 with the powerful threat of rook c2, a move which must be prevented at all costs. Bishop d1. This seems to do the trick, but Capablanca has two strings to his bow in the potential passed pawn's lust to expand. c3. B takes c3. b2. And now the rook must abandon his bishop, as the dangerous pawn must be destroyed. Restraining the pawn instead by bishop c2 loses instantly by the capture rook takes c2. Rook takes b2, rook takes d1. Rook c2. Capablanca's treatment of the ending from this point on is a revelation. While keeping white busy in the defense of his passed pawn, Capablanca whips up an attack which drives the king into a mating net. All this, done with so little material and in so few moves, makes this ending the very best of its kind. It will repay study by master as well as by amateur. Bishop f5 banishes the rook from the bishop file and the protection of the pawn. Rook b2, rook c1, and enables black to occupy the file and attack the pawn. Rook b3. The rook must assume a passive position in order to save the pawn. Bishop e4 check. King h3. There is no choice. If f3, rook c2 cost white a pawn. Back to the game. King h3, rook c2. The rook is in an ideal position on the 7th rank and behind the passed pawn. f4, h5. Every move a picture. This begins the hemming in process and institutes a threat of sudden mate by 41. Bishop f5 check. For example, bishop f5 check, king h4, rook takes h2 check, king g5, and king g7. Back to the game. After h5, g4, h takes g4 check, king takes g4, Rook takes h2, rook b4, f5 check, king g3, or king g5, king g7, and mate by rook h5 to follow. Back to the game. King g3, rook e2, rook c4, rook takes e3 check, king h4, king g7, obviously intending to surround the king, rook c7 check, king f6, relentlessly precise to the last. On king h6, the reply, rook e7, pins the bishop. If then, rook takes c3, rook e6, bishop g2, rook takes g6, and white either forces a draw by stalemate or wins the bishop. Back to the game. King f6, rook d7, bishop g2, rook d6 check, king g7, white resigns. If rook d7 check, king h6, followed by rook h3 is mate. Capablanca himself says of this game, "I was able to wind up the match with one of the most accurate games I have ever played."